Hi. Thank you all so much for coming tonight to this event from Staten Island to Palestine, resisting Israel's influence on militarized policing. I also want to thank Dr. Robin Spencer and Linda Sarsour for joining us tonight. We're really very honored that you could be here with us. We're here tonight during a historic moment, both in the debate surrounding racial justice and police brutality in the United States, and on the issue of justice for Palestinians living in the occupied Palestinian territories. In the wake of the violence of this past summer against unarmed Black civilians here in New York City and unarmed Palestinian civilians in Israel and Palestine, it is more important than ever that we recognize the parallels between the injustices faced by communities of color in New York and by Palestinians in the occupied territories, and that we work to dismantle the connections between the New York City Police Department and the Israeli government. Linda Sarsour is the executive director of the Arab American Association of New York, a social service agency that serves the Arab community in New York City. Linda has been featured in local, national, and international media speaking on women's issues, Islam, profiling, and surveillance of Muslim youth and political discussions on the Middle East. Linda will discuss the full picture of the different types of connections that exist between Israel and the NYPD and New York City in general. And she's also going to offer the Palestinian perspective on connections between the Palestinian movement for justice and the kind of activism that's happening here in New York, such as the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you so much, Robin. First and foremost, if I was not in Detroit yesterday, I would have been with you all in front of the New York City Council at the City Hall. And I just want to say to my friends at JVP, at Jews Against Islamophobia, and all the groups that were out there and have been organizing around the call to tell our New York City Council members that this is not the right trip to be going to, is a noble cause, and what you're doing is risky, and the slander that comes with it, and I've received it myself, and I know especially for folks who are Jewish Americans and having to hear from your own, I want you to know that you're taking a risk, and that we, at least as a Palestinian American, the appreciation and the love that I have for folks who do this work is so immense. It's hard for me to even express the gratitude that I have for your solidarity, for my family and for the Palestinian people. And I think this conversation is a really important conversation that we're having right now, because there's this overarching theme for me about accountability, right? And what stakes do we have in what's going on right now when we talk about policing and we talk about the U.S. and Israel. And it's important to understand how deep these ties are, and I don't think people even understand kind of the level of what I'm about to explain, and some of you might already know this. As a Palestinian American, I went to Ferguson myself, and I think one of the first initial points of solidarity were around young people in Gaza who barely have internet access, who were explaining through Twitter to young people in Ferguson how to deal with tear gas, right? And I think the young people in Gaza were probably thinking to themselves, hold up a second, tear gas against people in the United States of America? For them, they probably thought, this is only something that happens to us in the largest open-air prison in the world. This doesn't happen in a democratic country, a super world power like the United States. So I think I was actually quite ashamed when young people in Gaza were trying to explain to young people in Ferguson how to protect themselves against tear gas. Look, these connections that are being made between the Palestinian Liberation Movement and the Black Lives Matter movement is scaring the crap out of people like the ADL. So the minute that when the ADL gets alarmed about things, then I know somebody's doing something right, and those connections are good to be making, and we must be onto something, because they're not alarmed if we're not onto something. And I think what scares people like the ADL is when they see these solidarity movements and when they're saying, oh my God, imagine if African Americans and Palestinians and pro-Palestinian solidarity activists get together. Lord have mercy. We need to really understand what we're getting ourselves into here. So I'm quite excited about that, and it actually fuels me to continue connecting these dots on a deeper level. Now, our U.S. police forces have absolutely been militarized, and I give a lot of that to Israel, right? So since 2005, over 9,500 law enforcement executives have been trained by the Israeli military and Israeli police forces. And many of these trips are actually sponsored by the ADL and AJC. And this is something, of course, that you can find online. This is not private information. And the questions that come up for me is like, what kind of, what is where does the ADL get out of it? What does AJC get out of it? Like the fact that we're sending police force executives from the US to get trained in Israel and getting trained on counterterrorism efforts. For a long time, we already knew that the NYPD has international stations, right, in places like London, Hamburg, and Madrid, and other parts of the world, right? And the question for me always has been, look, the NYPD is a local police force. Like, don't we have the FBI? Don't we have the CIA? Don't we have military intelligence units? We have military posts across the world. The fact that the New York Police Department post 9/11 actually thought that they basically became a federal agency. Their manpower is actually larger than the FBI, right? And that really scares the crap out of me, because as a New Yorker, you want to think about the NYPD as this friendly local police force that's supposed to protect me from crime and, protect and serve me, when in fact what they're doing is they're engaging in counterterrorism work. So just think about that, right? So that always has scared me personally. A former U.S. Capitol Police Chief, Terrence Gaynor, called, a quote said, "Israel is the Harvard of terrorism." So basically, Israel is seen as the experts in countering terrorism, and that's why we get trained by the Israeli police forces and military. So what is the tangible evidence that the training is having and impacting on American policing is that both countries are using identical equipment against, for example, demonstrators, right? We're seeing the use of tear gas, right? We understand, for example, NYPD owns drones. And a lot of the equipment or the pictures of equipment, the riot gear that we see in the pictures in Ferguson, and even here in the US, if you go down Wall Street or like Financial District, you see people holding AK-47s and riot gears. If you've been to some of the protests recently, you've also seen the NYPD prepared just in case, right, something happens. And a lot of this came out in a report actually by an Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, who had photographs from Oakland, Anaheim, and Ferguson, and compared to what they saw also in places like in Israel and in the West Bank. It's important to understand also that, we're also learning things about surveillance, right? And I think Robin brought up something really important in how I connect the issues between what's happening in the Black Lives Matter movement and the Palestinian Liberation Movement. It's about the value of life. It's about this idea that people are guilty until proven innocent. It's about suspecting an entire people and saying, well, all these people have the potential to be terrorists, or these people all have the potential to be criminals, right? So we have to figure out how to watch them all or contain them all, right, to contain the problem. And it's exactly what the NYPD does here when it comes to NYPD surveillance, right? So what do? Unwarranted blanket surveillance of Muslim communities, right? Mosques, bookstores, cafes, pretty much monitoring the daily life of Muslims, and all of you already know this. And people will say, well, I heard and I read somewhere in an article that the NYPD closed down their demographics unit. So the clarification on the demographics unit is, the demographics unit is one unit of the New York Police Department's Intelligence Division, and their task was to map the Muslim community. They already mapped us. They already know exactly where we are. So technically, there was no real reason for that unit anymore. It was actually dwindling down. They already knew where we were, where we watched cricket, where we went to watch soccer and played soccer, and what mosques we went to. And they even labeled some of our leaders on these different lists like dangerous and like radical. And I was like, radical? I was like, that's kind of, I'm just kidding. I was gonna say that was kind of cool, but and this idea for me was when I went to Ferguson and I got to see it kind of like firsthand, this kind of militarization of our police force against unarmed, right? So in Ferguson, when I was standing in front of the Ferguson Police Department, people were unarmed. There were protesters, there were all kinds of people there, mostly people from the Ferguson area. And they were, standing face to face with people wearing riot gear. But there were no riots. So this assumption that a riot was going to happen anyway, because of course they were black people riot, so we have to be prepared for that. These assumptions that are being put on our community members, regardless of what communities we come from. And my thing was like, when I was standing there, I was thinking to myself, what is a young black kid who's standing there in front of the Ferguson Police Department thinking about themselves when they see these police officers wearing military gear, not just riot gear, there were some like wearing military like fatigues, right? You're basically an enemy of the state when your country is using military against their own citizens who are actually peacefully demonstrating. What kind of message do you send to your citizenry? And when we look at also things, when we talk about the connections of histories, look, 400 years of demoralization, alienation, humiliation, violence against black communities, right? So we can't obviously say the same about what's happening in Palestine. Well, it's more like 67 years, right? But there's a lot of lineage and things we can align there too on segregation, right? So when we look at, when we talk about apartheid and we talk about segregation and what Arab communities both in within the line, right, within Israel, within the Green Line, but also in the West Bank, this idea of segregation is something that when black colleagues of mine who Robin talked about were in Palestine, they saw that firsthand, right? And you saw the different bus lines. Like people are starting to understand there's some sort of connection of history there. But my concern always is like, I think about this as an American. I think to myself around militarization. I think to myself, this is my taxpayer dollars, right? Like your taxpayer dollars are paying to spy on Muslims, right? Our taxpayer dollars are paying for this equipment that's being used against us, including tear gas, right? And it's our taxpayer dollars that are deploying military within our own borders, but also deploying military on the other side of the world on people who are considered to be people of color, right? So the question also always for me is about accountability for our ends. Like, what is our stake in this? And our stake for me is always about my taxpayer dollars and who are they paying to oppress? And we're seeing that firsthand, that it's actually, we're not only oppressing these people of color across the world, but we're oppressing people of color right here in our own country, including black communities and Arab, Muslim, South Asian, and unfortunately those perceived to be any of those things, because sometimes people get caught up in that because, sometimes we just don't know the difference of these people. And my work has been recently in New York City around this Black Lives Matter movement and pushing, is building these connections, having these conversations, right? Because we can't just say to the NYPD, for example, look, stop stopping and frisking people who are black and Latino. Stop, oppressing protesters of any kind, because we saw in Occupy, for example, it wasn't just about oppressing people of color, it was oppressing people with certain political ideologies, right? So suppressing political views, right? So this is something that we have to understand, that we live in the United States of America. And when I think about actually in the context of like the Paris thing, by the way, I was just been thinking a lot about this idea of like, this big conversation we're having internationally now about freedom of speech, and this Western exception, like we're the only people in the whole world that care about not being censored. If you went to any corner of the world, down to the tips of Africa, to, even to the streets of parts of China, wherever you go, there isn't a human being on this world that's like, love being censored, by the way. Please keep suppressing my, freedoms. I don't want to be in a Democrat. I don't want to, no freedom for me. I'm good the way I am. That just doesn't exist, right? Freedom is a fundamental value that all people either have or aspire to have or want to have or enjoy. So in this big conversation on freedom of speech and freedom of expression in the West, it got me to think about, how do we take that conversation back internally, right? Within the West, including in the United States. Because we're suppressing freedom of speech right here in this country. Surveillance, for me, is a tactic to chill free speech, right? When you are suppressing protesters, right, whether you're brutalizing them or not allowing them to assemble, that is suppressing freedom of speech, right? When New York City Council members are trying to slander groups of people who are standing for peace and justice and calling them anti-Semitic, that is a way of suppressing free speech, right? So this larger conversation on police reform and connecting the dots between not just Black communities and Arab and Muslim communities, but all communities and all people who care about justice and equality and access and humanity. And when we talk about, you know, there's this whole debate about all lives matter. And then I don't know if you've seen that debate. It's like, really, people, all lives matter? Of course all lives matter. Like, thank you for stating the obvious. But in implementation, we know which lives are not being valued, right? And we need to be able to step aside and say, yes, all lives matter, put that to the side, that's obvious, right? All lives matter is like when people tell me to condemn terrorism. Really? Of course I condemn terrorism and I condemn the killing of innocent people. Do I really have to say that out loud? Do I really have to say that all life is the same and all life matter? That should be obvious to all of us. But I think we need to get to the place where we're able to say, Palestinian lives matter, right? Nigerian lives matter. For God's sakes, 2,000 people were massacred in the past 2 days, right? I don't see world leaders up in arms, you know, getting on airplanes and figuring out how to have a unity rally in Nigeria, right? We talk about, you know, when even talking about freedom of speech, Netanyahu was leading the charge at the Paris Unity rallies when you've killed how many journalists in a place like Gaza, when you haven't let journalists in to write about explicit war crimes, hiding the truth of what was happening in a place like Gaza. The hypocrisy, sisters and brothers, is absolutely ridiculous in this conversation that we're trying to have. So I'm gonna just, synopsis is basically this. We cannot be a community that says, let's just look at the New York Police Department and let's reform the New York Police Department, because it's much deeper than the New York Police Department, right? This is a philosophy and ideology that the US government has taken, and it's been taking it from Israel, right? And we understand, because we're well-informed people, that if we're gonna engage in what Israel is doing, obviously that hasn't been going too well, has it, right? You know, it should be obvious, but it's not obvious to the rest of the world. We also, as American citizens, need to be able to keep our government accountable to where our taxpayer dollars go. While we're shutting schools across the country in places like Chicago, right? We're laying off teachers, we're closing down hospitals, but we have millions of dollars to go into military intervention and to continue wars abroad, right? And every day we come up with this new reason why we have to go somewhere else. Or if we're not deploying actual military, we're deploying, you know, guns and military equipment to other people, even some people we don't know exactly who they are, and then they end up using their weapons against us, but that's a whole other story that we can talk about some other time. And then really bringing it back and saying that we're gonna stay courageous, and we're gonna stay connecting these dots, and we're not gonna allow people to tell us what dots to connect. And we need to strengthen this movement and make it broader, because it's about militarization here, it's about militarization abroad. The question I always have is, how do we bring the anti-war movement? One of the largest movements in this country is the anti-war movement. And I think if we were able to connect the dots in a much larger way, the anti-war movement would be a much larger presence in the work that we're doing. And they're there. They're coming out to the protests. They're understanding the connections, and they're making those connections. But I want to go back to the days when the Iraq War happened, and we had tens of thousands of people out on the street that were standing up and saying, we're anti-war. We are in a war right now, sisters and brothers, right here in our country. We are in a war of ideology. We are in a war of selecting what types of policing we want in our communities. And we as communities, especially communities with privilege, right? So when I look at myself, you know, I think in this current climate, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a person of privilege, but I still feel like I still have more privilege than a Black American Muslim in my community, right? Or maybe a South Asian Muslim, as an Arab American who lives in a place like Bay Ridge, right? And I think a lot of people in this room have a lot of privilege that can be used and kind of leveraged to kind of help elevate the concerns of policing in communities of color across the country. And I think obviously we're preaching to the choir, because the people in this room are those very people that are already doing that. But we just need like a whole bunch and lots more of you guys out there. And to connect that to something that's happening on Monday, January 19th, which is Martin Luther King's, not his real birthday, but the federal holiday. We're having a march, and there's 3 reasons why we're having this march right now. And I think it connects to the broader movement and why it's important for everyone to come out that day. Number 1, we're trying to reclaim Martin Luther King. I'm tired of this, like, Martin Luther King. I don't know who came up with this idea that on Martin Luther King Day we do community service. Community service is great, and we should be doing community service every day if we can. But that's not really what Martin Luther King was about. Martin Luther King was about justice, right? Justice for the people, equality. He wasn't about let's go paint a senior center on like Friday. He really wanted to get to the root of the cause of the problems and figure out a way to address them and work on mass mobilization to get to that point. So we're taking Monday as an opportunity to reclaim Martin Luther King and what he really stood for. That's number one. Number two, we're trying to reclaim the narrative. The narrative in the past couple of weeks has been, this is an anti-police movement. And with all the stuff that I just basically said for the past, I don't know how many minutes I've been speaking, probably more than I should have, is that we're not an anti-police movement. I'm not anti-law and order, personally, right? I understand there's a need sometimes for law and order, right? I'm just asking for equity, right? I'm asking not to be labeled suspect. I'm asking to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of your race, national origin, sexual orientation, whatever it is, we should be all treated with dignity and respect. So we're trying to reclaim the narrative that we're not an anti-police movement, right? That we are a movement about humanity, dignity, and the value of life, right? So we're trying to reclaim the narrative that has been pushed against us by the police unions, by some in the administration, and by, obviously, the, quote, pro-police, whoever those people are, right? And the third one is like we lost sight of why this movement exists right now, right? And it's kind of like what we were trying to do this summer with Gaza. We lost sight about the real victims here. The real victims are the people who've lost their lives to police violence. Like there are families right now that are going to bed that don't have fathers, that they've lost their sons, their daughters. And while we were mourning the lives of 2 police officers, which we should mourn, I was like horrified when that happened. I was like, oh my God, these poor guys, they have kids, I have kids. All of New York was able to empathize, right, with these 2 police officers who lost their life in such a tragic way. But what about Eric Garner, who was choked to death, who has 6 children, grandchildren? What about Romali Graham, who was shot in front of his grandmother and little brother unarmed in his own bathroom, right? What about Sean Bell? He was murdered the day before his wedding, 38 shots. Who shoots somebody 38 times? Why do you feel the need to have to put 40 bullets into a man? We're talking about, you know, Kimani Gray and Amadou Diallo, and I can sit here for days, Oscar Grant and Mike Brown, and I can sit here and name hundreds of people that have been lost to police violence. We have to reclaim that and remember why these people are going out into the streets. And I think it's important that we come out in full force to say that the movement has always been here, and we're back in full force because we believe our cause is noble, and we believe that people haven't received justice, and we need to get justice for our people. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for those inspiring talks. We're going to open it up now to question and answers.
We can have a whole panel on torture and who are the perpetrators of torture and how that connects politically, and even bringing in some of the, bringing in Saudi Arabia and what is actually Jordan's role in some of the capturing of political prisoners and their kind of weird relationship with the Israeli government and kind of some of that collaboration. Even now looking at Egypt and looking at this newfound government, we thought it was bad under Mubarak. It's one of those days where like you wish Mubarak was back kind of situation. That's really terrible, but I just said that. But you know what I mean? It's like kind of thinking like instead of when I look at the Middle East, I always look for progress, and I'm like, okay, we're getting into a better place, and then you get to that place and you're like especially on when it comes to kind of the pressure on Israel to end occupation and kind of putting those pressures on. We go from one dictator to someone who's like either as bad as the last one or maybe even worse than the one before him. So that's really concerning to me as well. But torture is widespread, and we know that in Israeli prisons, torture, they have different types of torture, many similar to what we saw in the torture report, including keeping prisoners, in freezing conditions, when it comes to, leaving people without food, the interrogation process, the torture that comes with interrogation. Oftentimes what they do is when they catch someone, a lot of the political prisons are in there because of torturing of detainees to bring in other people. Sometimes they actually are, unfortunately giving false information just to stop being tortured in detention. It's just a very corrupt system with no accountability. This is the problem. It's kind of when you look at the U.S., there's no accountability. Who oversees all those processes? And that's the problem here, right? Like, for God's sakes, how long did we fight for the UN or even groups like Amnesty International and others to even try to go in just to get information and just put information out publicly? And the conditions in the Israeli prisons are so atrocious that it's even hard to say even just being in there is torture in itself. and many of them who have been in there, in what we do this here in the United States too, what we call pre-trial solitary confinement. So people who are in solitary confinement or being subject to torture or detention and interrogations without ever being convicted of a crime. And not only are they sometimes not even convicted of a crime, then when they do convict them both here in the U.S., especially on national security issues in places like Israel and the U.S., we say we can't tell you why. We have convicted you on, quote, secret evidence, because if we tell you what the evidence is, it's a breach of our national security. So there are people both in Palestine and in places like Indiana and what we call the U.S. the Communications Management Unit. So this is another thing that your taxpayer dollars pay for. In 2006, the U.S. Board of Prisons created something called the CMUs, Communications Management Units, and they're in places like Indiana. They're super duper maximum security prisons, and they're pretty much for people who've been quote convicted of like terrorism-related crimes. Now, Muslims are like less than 1% of the U.S. population, right? But we make up over 85% of the CMUs. And there are many people that are in the CMUs who've been convicted on secret evidence, right? Or some people, like, for example, many of you know the story of Fahad Hashmi, who is a U.S. citizen, was a Brooklyn College student who spent 4 years. Imagine this, sisters and brothers. Like, this just boggles my mind in a place like the U.S. 4 years in pre-trial solitary confinement. Right here in the Metropolitan Detention Center, and I think he's still in there right now. And then eventually what happens, poor kid who's a student takes a plea bargain for 15 years. Of course he would. Who wouldn't do that? After you spent and experienced 4 years of pretrial solitary confinement, wouldn't you take a plea bargain and not go to trial in hopes that you might be there for 40, 50 years? God only knows what they would have gotten him for. So these are also some of the similarities when we talk about national security specifically and looking at, quote, counterterrorism and the people that are caught up in that national security web.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming tonight.